Okay, good morning or good midday or good evening, everybody, wherever you are sitting at the moment. I'm Angela Schottenhammer from the Trans-Pacific Research Group at KU Leuven in Belgium. And I'm very glad to welcome today Sebestian Kroupa. I'm especially glad because Sebestian is not only a historian of science, but he is also a biologist. He wrote his PhD dissertation on a very famous pharmacist and Jesuit missionary, Georg Joseph Kamel, entitled "A Jesuit Pharmacist at the Frontiers of Colonial Empires." And he received his PhD from the Darwin College, University of Cambridge in 2019. And he is currently still until 2024 also located at the University of Cambridge at the Department of History and Philosophy of Science. And he received a grant for a project entitled Plants and the Pacific, Tracing Knowledge Across a Sea of Islands, 1565 to 1750. So this is basically also a period that we also cover, and I think, or I hope that we can in the future really closely cooperate and just bring together our knowledge, because actually plants and also medicines made from plants, also in terms of agriculture and exchange of knowledge, plants are really very, very important. So thank you very much for speaking to us today, Sebestian, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Angela, for the very generous introduction. Many thanks for the introduction and the opportunity to present my work. It is a great pleasure to be here. So my paper today draws on one of the chapters from my PhD, actually, which I'm currently turning into a monograph, and which also inspired my new projects, which, as you mentioned, will examine trans-Pacific exchanges of plant knowledge and practice between Asia and America in the early modern era. I don't have any new research to present yet, very sadly, but hopefully we will continue to be having these conversations in the future. So my PhD focused on the sort of communication of medical and natural knowledge between the Philippines and Europe, mostly at the turn of the 18th century. And I traced movements of knowledge from the point of local encounters between indigenous peoples and European colonists to worldwide movements and receptions, as I sought to sort of decenter previous accounts of the mobility of early modern knowledge and emphasize the plurality of sites, agents, and traditions involved in the making of science and medicine. Can I actually share my screen? Would it be possible to make me a co-host or something?
Yeah,
just to show my slides. Sorry, I probably should have mentioned earlier.
You can do it right now, Sebestian.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks so much. Okay, I hope you can all see this. So in my talk today, I will focus on the practices of the Jesuit pharmacist Georg Joseph Kamel. In 1687, Kamel was sent as a missionary to the Philippines, which was then a colony under the Spanish flag. And during his stay, he produced treatises concerned with Philippine plants and animals, in which he included episodes from his medical practice. And I will use these sources to demonstrate how Kamel understood Philippine nature, appropriated Philippine medicinal plants into European frameworks of knowledge, and therefore equipped them for both local use and global circulations. I will first explain how and why Kamel sought to Galenize Philippine plants, that is, to appropriate them into the Galenic humoral framework. And my case study will be the St Ignatius bean, the only drug native to the Philippines to be globally marketed in the early modern Europe, in the early modern era. By tracing the bean's trajectory from local contexts to its introduction in European and American markets, I will show how a medicinal plant used by indigenous communities became a globally consumed commodity. Although Kamel's methods facilitated the global circulation of the St. Ignatius bean, some elements of his work were lost in translation. And to provide an example of such a disruption, I will end by discussing Kamel's system of plant classification and his use of indigenous knowledge. So Kamel was born in 1661 in Brno in the present-day Czech Republic, where he was educated at the local Jesuit college. He entered the Society of Jesus in 1682 as a lay brother before beginning his apprenticeship in pharmacy. He was trained in the Galenic tradition, and his understanding of medicine was humoral. In 1687, Kamel was listed among the Czech Jesuits selected for the Philippine mission. Upon his arrival in Manila, which was sometime between 1688 and 9, Kamel added to the establishments of the local Jesuit college, the first Jesuit pharmacy in the Philippines. His workshop was located in the southernmost part of the Intramuros, or the Spanish-walled city of Manila. Kamel's fellow missionary, Pedro Murillo Velarde, described how the pharmacy held, quote, plenty of remedies for the common good, stored in flasks, jars, and fine earthenware from China and Japan, with various decorations and paintings, end quote. Kamel's medical duties soon led him to explore local nature, the specimens of which he began to collect and document in order to identify resources which he could use in his practice. Now, in colonial Manila, medical professional hierarchies and identities were much less rigid than in Europe. And in addition to working as a pharmacist, Kamel also saved the college the salary paid to the physician, as he himself filled this role. Promptly after his arrival in the Philippines, Kamel established himself as a colonial medical authority in Manila. The limited numbers of competitors in Manila acted in his favor. As he confessed to his compatriot Šimon Boruhradský, who was stationed in Mexico, there is no physician here but 4 friars, who know little more than my pair of trousers. Under Kamel's tenure, the Jesuit pharmacy became one of the most reputable colonial medical establishments in Manila, and his reputation soon spread beyond the Philippine Islands. By the late 1690s, Kamel was engaged in a correspondence network which extended from New Spain across the Philippines to London. And his involvement in this network enabled Kamel to deliver his reports of Philippine nature to London, where they appeared in print. Most of Kamel's treatises came out in the most of Kamel's descriptions of Philippine plants were published as an appendix to the 3rd volume of John Ray's Historia Plantarum, or the History of Plants, one of the most prominent botanical publications of the turn of the 18th century. And the remainder of Kamel's treatises came out in the Philosophical Transactions. A few drawings were also published in James Pettiver's periodicals, such as my favorite example, the flying cat monkey on the right here. Now, Kamel's accounts shed light on the patients he treated and the drugs he employed. He commanded a broad clientele, which predominantly included his fellow Jesuit brothers, but also crown officials and indigenous and enslaved people. In his treatments, Kamel extensively relied on plants native to the Philippines. One of the local herbs he claimed to have used regularly was tanglat, a rush-like plant. Kamel wrote that tanglat stimulates the evacuation of urine, menses, fetuses, gas, watery edema, and renal calculi, as well as acting as a laxative, as I have tried with 4 patients who were suffering from considerable constipation. Although Kamel regularly drew on Philippine substances, A closer look at his accounts reveals that he saw local plants predominantly through the prism of European drugs and Galenic theory. He adopted tongue glove into his practice because he had previously identified it as a kind of squinem, which was a plant recommended by classical Greco-Roman authorities against obstructions of humus. This suggests that Kamel combed local nature for plants related to those he already knew and which he could use as substitutes in the treatments he had learned at home. And in this respect, Kamel was drawing on a long pharmaceutical tradition of succedania, or replacements. Now, this established practice was modeled on the treatise De Succedaneis, which was attributed to Galen, and which provided practical lists of substances that could replace ingredients that were rare, expensive, or simply unavailable at the time of need. Now, early modern handbooks advised that substitutes should agree in their virtues, nature, and characteristics such as taste and smell. And indeed, Kamel's associations were typically based on morphology, like in the case of tongue gloves, often used in combination with sensory cues. For example, he believed the herb suganda, quote, smelled of thyme and oregano, end quote, and therefore used the herb as a substitute for the two plants. Kamel's investigations of local plants therefore seemed not to be motivated necessarily by the hunger to discover new cures, so much as by the desire to find substitutes for those already known to him. Kamel searched Philippine nature for locally available substitutes, largely due to the high costs of importing Galenic drugs from Mexico. As I discussed in my PhD, the Royal Hospital in Manila, which was funded and administered by the Spanish Crown, received enormous consignments of European drugs from Mexico every year. In 1642 and 1717, which are 2 years for which complete inventories survive, the Royal Hospital received shipments of 1,200 and 1,500 kilograms of remedies from Mexico, respectively. Roughly 95% of these remedies belonged to the traditional Galenic pharmacopoeia of substances native predominantly to Europe and the Mediterranean. Added to the mix were a few American drugs, which had been domesticated by the Spaniards by the 17th century, such as guayacun, sarsaparilla, or halal. In 1717, the price of the drugs imported that year exceeded 10,000 pesos. So to put this rather complex and expensive enterprise into perspective, the salary of the hospital's physician in Manila was in the region of a few hundred pesos per year. Now, compared to the Spanish crown, the funds available to the Philippine Jesuits were considerably more modest. To finance their medical establishments, religious orders relied on combinations of donations from the local populations and authorities, on their own monastic coffers, and also on sponsorship from the crown, the so-called limosna de medicinas. The amount annually dispensed by the crown to the Philippine Jesuits was a meager 150 pesos, so about 1.5% of the sum that the crown spent on the drugs for the Royal Hospital in Manila. As the Jesuits constantly complained, this royal subsidy was hardly sufficient to secure adequate medical provisions, and the lengthy transportation created additional issues regarding preservation. In 1686, the Jesuits procurador of the Philippine province, Luis de Morales, lamented that the imported medicines are of such bad quality that they are more likely to harm than help the patients, and therefore the pharmacists fear administering them not to put in risk the health of those who at such a cost to your majesty have been brought to these missions. It was predominantly for this reason that Kamel turned to what local nature could offer. Since the importation of remedies was a pricey, lengthy, and uncertain business, local substances were used out of necessity and primarily as substitutes for the rare, expensive, or unavailable European drugs. As Kamel's work shows, Galenism not only underpinned this adherence to European remedies, but it also offered a compelling framework for understanding plants from the New World. As a highly flexible system that claimed worldwide applicability, Galenism could be used to describe plants, animals, and peoples all around the world. Humanism thus offered the Jesuits a universal and a shared language in the increasingly globalized and fragmented early modern world. Galenism enabled the Jesuits to both incorporate new substances into the European universe and communicate this knowledge further. Crucially, human language made new substances understandable as much to fellow Jesuits as to European medical practitioners, merchants, and customers, therefore opening avenues for commodification and profit. The engagements of the Jesuits in the drug trade have received increasing attention, especially with respect to their involvement in the extraction and distribution of cinchona, which even earned the drug the moniker the Jesuit bark. The Philippines offer a different example, the St Ignatius bean. Kamel's treatise on the bean, which was published in 1699 in the Philosophical Transactions, was the first comprehensive account of the plant printed in Europe. Locally called igasud, the plant has been identified by modern botanists with Strychnos ignatii, a tree native to the Visayan Islands, where its seeds had been used in healing prior to the European arrival. The eastern portion of the Visayas fell under the Jesuits' jurisdiction, and it was probably here that they learned about the seed's powers. By rebranding igasud as the beans of St Ignatius, the founder of their order, the Jesuits sought to impose their authority and trademark upon the remedy. The seed's virtues were now literally vested in by the holy founder of the Jesuit order, rather than rooted in local indigenous beliefs. Now, adopting substances from indigenous sources raised two major issues for the Jesuits. Firstly, and crucially for Catholic missionaries, there were spiritual concerns at play. Since the Filipinos had been pagans prior to the Spanish arrival, their knowledge of igasud could have come from the devil, and its powers could well be demonic. So to place the source of knowledge of the bean on what they considered legitimate non-indigenous foundations, the Jesuits had to dissociate it from the local context. Basically, effacement of indigenous agency presented the safest way towards adoption. And indeed, missionaries in Jesuit works commonly appears to be simply using indigenous plants without having received any local help, discovering their virtues by accident or divine inspiration, and testing them through experience. With igasud specifically, the Jesuits framed its discovery as a fortuitous accident. In his treatise, Kamel recounted a captivating story of a Jesuit priest saved by the beans when a spiteful indigene attempted to poison him. It was casualiter, or literally by chance, that the priest happened to have a dried bean on him, which was the first occasion that the Spaniards learned about the virtues and powers of igasud. And this chance discovery then led to further investigations, the results of which Kamel recounted in his treatise. Secondly, to reinvent the bean as a legitimate drug and enable its movement from its place of origin, the bean has to be embedded within theoretical frameworks acknowledged as valid by the Europeans, which was achieved by Galenization. Based on its morphology, taste, and other qualities, Kamel recognized igasud as the nux vomica of the Arabian physician Serapion the Younger, whose work had been assimilated into the Galenic corpus centuries prior. Associations between local plants and canonical authors appear throughout Kamel's writings and the works of other Jesuit missionaries around the world. And such efforts to match plants described by the ancients with their contemporary counterparts were a widespread practice with long humanist roots, as the true identity of these plants had been lost over the centuries, but their efficacy certified by the highest authorities. And Kamel could identify Philippine plants with those described by ancient authors without any intrinsic contradictions, because the regions of East Indies and its products, such as cinnamon or nutmeg, were known to ancient writers. So in the eyes of European scholarship, it was by no means impossible that a plant mentioned by classical authors should be native to lands far to the east, even as far as the Philippines. Establishing commonality between the old and the new was the first step towards assimilation. So by identifying local plants with those described by ancient authors, the Jesuits downplayed their novelty and introduced them to European readers in a familiar guise. Moreover, by establishing commonalities between people and nature of ancient and new worlds, the Jesuits could construct unified human and natural histories of the world that highlighted the shared roots of all humankind and therefore the universal potential for conversion. To galvanize igasud, Kamel had to demonstrate that it shared key properties with Nux vomica. Serapion himself praised Nux vomica for its emetic qualities. Quote, "It helps to vomit and sets humus in motion, making it easier for them to come out by vomiting." In addition to pointing to similarities in morphology, Kamel presented several cases from his medical practice, which clearly attested to the bean's emetic virtues. Based on the evidence gathered, Kamel concluded that the bean, quote, "frequently tends to induce vomiting," end quote. He therefore bolstered the Galenic associations he had drawn and presented the knowledge of the bean's virtues as emerging from Jesuit trials rather than as borrowed from local healing practices. Kamel's experiments also revealed some undesirable side effects. He reported that most of his patients suffered from violent seizures. To give an example, I once diluted 1 scruple of the powder of the St Ignatius bean and gave it to Vicente Alsina, who was a fellow Jesuit missionary, endowed with a melancholic constitution, to provoke regurgitation, as you would with the St Ignatius bean. He was troubled with indigestion, diarrhea, frequent nausea, sour belching, and copious flatulence. As soon as he took it, he was seized with a tremor of the whole body, which lasted for 3 hours, together with an itching and terrible convulsive twitching, so that he could not stand. It was strongest and most troublesome in his jaws, forcing him to a kind of laugh. He was having a seizure. Meanwhile, there was no notable alteration in the pulse, and there were no other subsequent symptoms. Afterwards, he felt somewhat better. Good for him, really. Kamel ascribed these violent effects to the differences between indigenous and European bodies. Quote, "In Spaniards, igasud almost always causes spasmodic convulsions, but not in the indigenes." End quote. This observation was in line with Galenic theory, which posited that European and indigenous human constitutions, built under very different climates, would differ and hence react to the same substance in different ways. Kamel recommended to his European leaders to use the bean with caution and in small doses. His experiments with native materia america therefore seems to be motivated partly by the desire to test its suitability for European human constitutions or for European medical climates, both in Manila and beyond. In these assessments, the Jesuits used as instruments the bodies of the colonists, of the indigenes, and also of their own. Kamel's treatment of the St. Ignatius bean therefore suggests that to be redefined as a drug, the bean has to be stripped of its original cultural context and codified within European theoretical frameworks. Foreign substances were inherently regarded with skepticism, which was overcome through testing and recontextualization of drugs into European frameworks. Through inscription into the Galenic corpus, local plants were turned into drugs and indigenous beliefs into legitimate knowledge. The reinvention of igasud as a Galenic medicine paved the way for its deployment on both local and global scales and markets. And indeed, when browsing through 18th century European works of materia america, there is only one drug native to the Philippines that appears regularly, the St. Ignatius bean. Its supply was mediated by the Jesuits, who seem to have circulated the bean to Europe in relatively low quantities. For instance, during the entire 18th century, the bean featured only in 17 transactions at Amsterdam public auctions, which suggests that although it was known to traders and pharmacists, it was not very widely available. The Jesuits did not need to circulate the drug in vast amounts to make its commerce profitable. The beans could be displayed as curiosities, donated as gifts to patrons, or used as bribes to solicit favors from officials. The bean's value was rooted in its rarity and the status as a curiosity that it carried, or of the faraway Philippine archipelago that it represented. Indeed, the drug commanded high price and esteem in 18th century Europe. For example, in 1730, while waiting in Seville for his ship to New Spain, the German Jesuit missionary Philip Zegesser sent home to his brother, quote, 25 St Ignatius beans, which are greatly desired both in Rome and in Vienna, and one has to consider it a blessing to get one or two, end quote. Still in 1750, the bean appeared among the most expensive items available in the drug trading hub of Lisbon. Over the course of the 18th century, the bean was increasingly finding its way into pharmacies and pharmacopoeias across Europe, therefore. And despite the proliferation of new inquiries, Kamel's treatise in the philosophical transactions remained an authoritative account throughout the 18th century. Even 50 years after its initial appearance, the German scholar Caspar Neumann wrote, quote, the best account we have to date of this plant and of the origin of this so-called St. Ignatius bean is from Father Kamel, end quote. This longevity can be attributed to the privileged access to the source material that Kamel possessed, which enabled him to provide a detailed description and figures based on observation of the entire plant, rather than just of its commodified seeds. European scholars were keenly interested in the plant's morphological features, information central to 18th century classification practices. Although, unlike Kamel, scholars in Europe generally considered the bean to be a new drug, unknown to the ancients, Kamel's associations with Serapions nux vomica endured and earned the bean a clearly defined place in European traditions of materia medica, as the two plants were frequently treated and classified together. Most authors warned of the bean's powerful effects and advised cautious use, drawing among others on the examples introduced by Kamel himself. As the bean was becoming integrated into the European pharmacopoeia, any mentions of indigenous knowledge and uses discussed in Kamel's account were increasingly marginalized. Whereas Jesuit missionaries had to be aware of the bean's local Filipino meanings and significance, this information had little value for European scholars. In a rather symptomatic way for European science and medicine, this lack of concern for non-European knowledge is probably the reason why so many modern sources, including Wikipedia, wrongly credit Kamel with discovering and naming the St. Ignatius bean. Publishing a treatise in a European journal translated here into ownership and control over the drug. The St. Ignatius bean moved from the Philippines not only in the westwards direction to Europe, but also eastwards across the Pacific. The bean appeared in the work of Kamel's compatriots Johannes Steinheffer, another Bohemian Jesuit pharmacist who was stationed in Mexico. Steinheffer approved of the bean for women's diseases, a recommendation that also had appeared in Kamel's treatise. Indeed, the two Bohemian pharmacists were engaged in correspondence, and it seems highly likely that Steinheffer learned about the bean from Kamel. Although Kamel hinted at a frequent exchange with Steinheffer in his letters, only one document survives from their exchange. A list of items sent by Kamel to Steinheffer in May 1697, rubber-stamped by Spanish officials. This consignment from Kamel to Steinheffer included rare goods from all over Asia, including a horn of rhinoceros, pezoar stones from Persia, tea from China, and ambergris from Japan. In addition to these precious items with application in medicine, Kamel included luxury consumer goods, such as an ivory figure of infant Jesus and chests inlaid with nacre. As the record states, Kamel purchased these items with the 100 pesos that Steinhofer had sent him, plus another 20 pesos which Kamel owed him. Finally, Kamel also threw in, quote, 3 oriental bezoar stones weighing 12 ounces on my tab, which my brother Steinhofer can sell to me as he wishes, end quote. So Kamel's shipment to Steinhofer hints at a series of financial investments in which the pair exchanged sums of money to be used to acquire valuable items, which would then be sold on with profits. Kamel, who was situated in Manila at the intersection of commercial links that spanned the Indo-Pacific, gained access to rare objects from China, India, Japan, and Persia, as well as to trans-Pacific markets, and thereby could emerge as a successful and very rich transcontinental trader. And these trans-Pacific exchanges provided some of the inspiration for my new project, in which I will be looking at exchanges of plant knowledge and practice between Asia and America, with a particular focus on the Philippines. And I very much hope that my research will bring me into closer conversation with you all. Now, in my final part of the talk, I will show that despite the success story of the St Ignatius beam, not all elements of Kamel's work were successfully transmitted from Philippine into global contexts, and some were indeed lost in translation. One such example was Kamel's plant classification. Early modern attempts to systematize the plant kingdom commonly started with the division between herbs and trees. Very intuitive, right? Although the philosophical limitations of this bipartite methods were widely discussed, it was retained by most authors, including Kamel's correspondent in London, John May. In Kamel's classification of Philippine flora, the Jesuit was clearly inspired by May's method, whose masterpiece, Historia Plantarum, he saw at a friend's several years ago and considered a work supremely brilliant, for which all posterity will give you deserved credit, adequate to such a greatly useful work. Kamel used very similar criteria of arrangement and directly borrowed many of his classes, which would have facilitated the reception of Kamel's work in Europe. But there was one exception, which distinguished Kamel from May and from other botanists. In addition to the 2 main classes, herbs and trees, Kamel added one further main division, climbing plants or vines. To my knowledge, the decision to use climbing plants as one of the main categories and thus create a tripartite scheme has no parallel in early modern natural history. Kamel never explained his decision to abandon this traditional dichotomy between herbs and trees, and therefore we can only speculate about his reasons. It is highly unlikely that Kamel's inspiration came from Europe. Instead, I suggest we should look for answers in the local context. In the Philippines, Kamel was confronted with an abundance of plants, such as lianas, that did not comfortably fit into either of the 2 European categories, a challenge that sedentary European scholars did not typically face. It was most probably to accommodate for these misfits that Kamel resolved to devise a whole new category. And very incidentally, Filipino indigenous taxonomies commonly include vines or climbing plants as one of the divisions, typically alongside herbs and woody plants. For example, the Tagalog people, with whom Kamel interacted most extensively, traditionally distinguished 4 main groups of plants, identical to those used by Kamel: trees, shrubs, herbs, and vines. Note that Kamel grouped trees and shrubs into a single category to get a tripartite scheme, perhaps to reflect the Holy Trinity. The Ifugao people in northern Luzon even use an identical tripartite system to the one used by Kamel. So this evidence raises the possibility that Kamel's classification system was actually inspired by indigenous categories of knowledge. Kamel himself did not directly acknowledge any such influences, of course. His approach to indigenous knowledge was rather ambivalent. In his private correspondence, we can find hints at his high regards for local expertise. In 1690, he wrote that a specific condition was very dangerous in these islands due to the lack of wise women able to cure it. Later, he reaffirmed his respect for the indigenes and their abilities in one of his letters, in which he praised the ingenious and knowledgeable inhabitants of Luzon, Luzon being the largest Philippine island, in which Manila is located and where Kamel was also stationed. So this contrasts rather sharply with his aforementioned opinion on his Spanish medical competition, which he compared to his pair of trousers. And indeed, there are indications that Kamel worked closely with indigenous informants. For example, he occasionally left gaps in his notes for vernacular names, probably to be obtained later from a local source. Despite these hints, indigenous people left few traces in Kamel's publications, which were intended for European readers. He probably realized that his learned European audiences might be at odds with knowledge derived from local sources. Whilst Kamel's accounts are brimming with detailed information about local habits and customs, no indigenous informant is ever acknowledged directly or by name. In only very few cases did Kamel recognize drawing on indigenous knowledge. In one of his treatises, for example, he included a compilation of notes that he had, quote, acquired not from my own experience, but vicariously, collected and excerpted from various observations and remarks from both the indigenes and otherwise curious persons, end quote. For Kamel, useful knowledge could be located anywhere in the world, including among the Filipinos. But the source of such information was questionable and needed to be verified and described to experience and observation in order to avoid any associations with demonic powers. For example, in his treatise of Tugus, a fragrant bush related to cardamom, Kamel wrote, on account of the agreeable smell that the berries of Tugus emit, the Filipinos wear them around their necks. Besides, experience has taught them that these berries cure centipede bites when chewed and placed on the wounds. But my favorite example is from Kamel's discussion of amuyong, which he identified also as a species of cardamom. He wrote, taught by magistra experiencia, or the master teacher experience. The Filipinos and I know to use this in paralysis and other ailments. So here, reliance on experience placed Kamel and the Filipinos at the same level in hierarchies of knowledge. Experience emerges here as a universal criterion that Kamel used to evaluate and validate different pieces of evidence, including those from indigenous sources. And this suggests that if portrayed as acquired empirically, non-European knowledge could be more easily assimilated into European systems. However, this is not what happened with Kamel's classification system and his climbing plans. When trying to publish his work in Europe, Kamel paid dearly for departing from the time-honored dichotomy between herbs and trees. They decided to leave out Kamel's section on climbing plants from his Historia altogether and included only Kamel's descriptions of trees and herbs. The third additional group which Kamel introduced based on his local experience simply could not be reconciled with his own system and with the contemporary European botanical practice. Despite the unfortunate fate of his climbing plants, Kamel managed to publish his work in a major botanical publication of his time, even as a lowly Jesuit pharmacist stationed in a faraway Manila. His bold attempt to develop an original plant classification scheme points to his ambitions to establish himself as a learned botanist. Kamel's system was as much a product of global ambitions as it was of global borrowings. In it, we can observe how the work of a Bohemian Jesuit missionary stationed in the Philippines was shaped by that of a sedentary English naturalist and also by local indigenous people. So this example highlights the proliferation of early modern global links and their power to shape scientific practices in geographically distinct contexts. Kamel's category of climbing plants then demonstrate how these global influences readily interacted and became entangled with local contingencies. But even if well suited for systematizing Philippine nature, this foreign hybrid group found little appreciation among sedentary European naturalists and became lost in translation between Manila and London. To quickly conclude my paper, Kamel's practices demonstrate that European medical traditions proved flexible enough to accommodate for plants native to the Philippines, which enabled Kamel to downplay their novelty and embed them within European knowledge. Kamel looked at Philippine plants predominantly through the prism of the Galenic theory, as he searched for local substitutes for remedies already known to him. Kamel's projects therefore offer an interesting nuance to prevailing narratives of colonial bioprospecting and the European hunger for the so-called green gold. Not all European encounters with new substances were bioprospective, and colonial sites did not by default yield new drugs for European exploitation. For Kamel, classical works represented essential instruments for understanding Philippine nature. It was by recourse to the language of antiquity that Kamel was able to describe novelty. In his work, canonical authors and their plants, such as Serapion and his Lux Vomica, feature essentially as dictionary categories. Stripped of their contextual meaning and stabilized through centuries of tradition, they were fixed enough to mediate across different contexts. Prior to the establishment of the Linnaean system, ancient terminology therefore provided a stable enough language in an increasingly fragmented Europe and offered a degree of continuity amidst the early modern flood of names and objects. It was through naming and assimilation into familiar schemes that European naturalists turned foreign plants into understandable entities. Through incorporation into the Galenic corpus, Kamel sought to turn local remedies into drugs and indigenous beliefs into legitimate knowledge. Importantly, as shown by the example of the St Ignatius bean, Galenization not only facilitated local adoption, but also equipped substances for movement beyond the Philippines. However, it is important to emphasize that even if the St Ignatius bean was a success story for the Jesuits, reliance on identical strategies did not necessarily guarantee the successful transplantation of all Philippine flora. The St Ignatius bean was, in fact, the only drug native to the Philippines to enter the European pharmacopoeia in the 18th century. And in accordance with Galenic theory, the question of the bean's suitability for European bodies remained an obstacle to its wider circulation. As illustrated by the bean's violent effects on unaccustomed European bodies, as well as the fate of Kamel's classification system, foreign substances and knowledge categories were therefore always in danger of being regarded with skepticism by the Europeans. These stories of disruptions and limitations remind us how difficult it was to move knowledge around in the early modern era. And indeed, mobility was by no means a default property of knowledge. As we also have seen, the movements of information between the Philippines and Europe were accompanied by the increasing erosion of indigenous knowledge. Despite these efforts to efface local agencies, it is by recovering these processes of translation that we as historians stand to gain insights into what cross-cultural knowledge encounters entails. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much.